Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of HC, a Third Culture Kid, where I, as a third culture kid, share my thoughts, experiences, and conversations. A third culture kid is someone that grew up in a country that's different from the one that their parents were raised in, and that's me, because I grew up in Brazil. I grew up in Brazil most of my life, and I was born in Korea, and I was educated in an American school all the way throughout my childhood. So that's me, a third culture kid. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is going to be a monologue, and I've been doing some monologues already, and hopefully I improve with each monologue. So I try to learn some of my mistakes from my past monologue, and hopefully this one's better. The theme of today's podcast is violence and crimes during the pandemic. And specifically, I asked the question, has violence and crimes increased or decreased during the pandemic? And I had a hypothesis. I just wanted to explore the hypothesis a little bit. And the hypothesis was that violence and crimes decreased during the pandemic. That was my hypothesis. And the rationale that I had for this was if there are less people on the streets, then there's just less opportunities there's just less opportunities for crime to be had. So for that reason alone, and I know it's just one, but I thought it was a sufficient reason for me to then conclude that violence and crimes would have decreased during the pandemic. Now, I'll find that hypothesis was a little maybe simple-minded a little bit, or at least the rationale behind it. But in summary, to summarize my findings and the conclusions, after my Google search results, looking at all the articles, in summary, I was able to conclude that crimes have indeed decreased during the pandemic, which aligns with my hypothesis. But violence itself, violent crimes, they have remained relatively the same and maybe slightly elevated. Was that a conclusion? Let me check. Slightly. Actually, it was just relatively similar to pre-pandemic levels. Yeah. So that was the conclusion I drew after research, which aligned about half, with my hypothesis. Crimes have decreased, yes. But violence itself didn't increase, nor did it decrease. It remained relatively the same, but it didn't increase. So I thought that was pretty notable. If this podcast is too long and you don't have time to listen to this, those are the conclusions, and you can take that away for what it's worth, and then just stop listening to this podcast. But if you want to hear about the details, stay tuned. So now I'm just going to share with you guys the Google search results and the research that I did and what I found. So quick context, what I did really, how I started off with this was doing a Google search results, just searching for violence during the pandemic. And that was really it. Like, it was that simple. And when I did that, I got, you see the top 10 results from Google. And the top 10 results all showed domestic violence increasing. Those just apparent from the headlines. Domestic violence has increased, and all the top 10 results were regarding that. And my initial reaction when seeing that was like, I didn't search specifically for domestic violence, but the results seemed to be skewed towards giving me a picture of domestic violence, and in that category of crime, an increase in trend of that crime. So immediately I just thought that the search results were skewed towards having me believe just one side of the narrative that may draw more attention from the readers because, domestic violence has increased. So that by itself, I just noted. It seemed a little bit skewed. Nonetheless, so I noted that I would probably have to do some additional research to go beyond just domestic violence, since I was curious about violence and crimes in general, really. But nonetheless, I decided to take a look at these articles. And I started with this Harvard study that was published in May 2020. And a line here that really just indicated to me that maybe perhaps domestic violence is indeed increasing. Or there's a fact here that really does indicate, yes, domestic violence perhaps really did increase during the pandemic. Is this line from the Harvard study that says, French police reported a nationwide spike of about 30% in domestic violence, which includes sexual violence, since the lockdown began. I don't know when the French lockdown began, but it can't have been earlier than January 2020. So if the article was published in May 2020, the time span by which this increase in violence was observed was about at max 5 months, I imagine. So to me, it wasn't like a really long time sample that more robustly said, yes, domestic violence has increased during the pandemic compared to if it was a year's worth of data. So that's something to keep in mind. But regardless, this 5 months at max of the finding here and the observation from this Harvard study, 30% in domestic violence increase in France since the lockdown began. So one country observed a significant surge in domestic violence. So I was convinced, okay, all right, so in France it increased, but now I want to see if globally it increased as well. So I turned to another article from time.com, and this was published in 2021. And this one says that surveys around the world have shown that domestic abuse spiking since January of 2020, jumping markedly year over year compared to the same period in 2019. And then it goes on to say that incidents of domestic violence compared, so if the article is published in 2021 and they're observing a spike since January 2020, it's about a year's worth of data of seeing the trends and the frequency of domestic violence compared to the year of 2019. So year 2020 compared to year 2019, pre-pandemic compared to pandemic. And some of the statistics cited are incidents of domestic violence increased 300% in Hubei, China, 25% in Argentina, South American country, 30% in Cyprus. I honestly, I don't know what country that is, sorry. But another country in the world, 33% in Singapore, and 50% in Brazil. So I now see a collection of countries that observed an increase in domestic violence. So at this point I conclude, domestic violence has indeed increased during the pandemic. And then you go on to think about this makes sense. And you try to understand why would that domestic violence have increased? And it's kind of related to the rationale that I cited in support of my hypothesis, at least the theme of it, that the location of crimes generally to be had was like streets. So if the location of crimes is transferred elsewhere, aka domestic, because of the lockdown, then there's more opportunities for crime to be had. So instead of thinking it simply as an increase in crime, I thought of it as a transfer of what was likely going to be existing crimes from one location to another. So from the street to the home. So that's kind of how I analyzed that. And it made sense because a lot of people were going to be at home. So there's just more opportunity for crimes to occur at home. And domestic violence already existed, and the lockdown only exacerbated that. So that was kind of my analysis, my intuitive analysis of that. And conclusion, domestic violence has indeed increased during the pandemic. But now I also wanted to look at other violence. Because that was not the initial question that I set out to understand wasn't just domestic violence. It was general violence, also crimes, really. So I went on to look at some other articles, and gun violence was kind of at the forefront of my mind as well too, because gun violence has been in the spotlight in the media throughout the pandemic and the lockdown. I mean, just recently the Kyle Rittenhouse case where he killed men with a gun. And he in court, he was the defendant, mainly claiming it was self-defense. He was acquitted of that charge, and the jury's verdict was not guilty. But that, regardless of whether you agree with that statement or not, I mean, that's still the subject matter of that case, and that instance was gun violence. And then also very recently, when was this? On November 30th, So on November 30th, there was a mass shooting that occurred at Oxford High School in Detroit, Michigan. So in Michigan, where 4 students were killed and 7 people were injured, where a high school student just opened fire and killed all these people and killed all these students. So again, gun violence. So lots of media spotlight on gun violence, and these are all horrific crimes committed with a gun. So that was kind of at the forefront of my mind, or at least that was one of like the areas that I was interested in looking at. But we have the instances of gun violence, but the question still remained. These are horrible, but what does the aggregate data show us? Like, how frequent are this? Has gun violence increased? We may like subjectively think that gun violence has increased if we're just looking at the media reports, but what does the aggregate data show us? Like the individual instances are not sufficient in evidence as gun violence has indeed increased. So what does the aggregate data show us? So I found an article that was published in October 22, 2021, so pretty recent, less than 2 months ago. And this article basically said gun violence has increased during the pandemic. I'm going to read some specific lines. And this article was from usnews.com, again published in October 22, 2021. Gun violence, I'm reading the line now. Gun violence skyrocketed more than 30% across the United States during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm out in 2020. And it's 30%, and they give the specific numbers here. Almost 39,000 injuries and deaths nationwide involved a gun in the year starting in February 2019. So this is a pre-pandemic period. So February 19 to February 2020, 39,000 injuries and deaths nationwide that involved a gun. That number shot up to more than 51,000 between March 2020 and March 2021, the pandemic lockdown period. So that is about like a 30% increase. So just given those numbers, that was sufficient. Gun violence has indeed, at least in the U.S., gun violence has increased during the pandemic. Apparently, Alaska was the exception. It was registering fewer incidents of gun violence during the pandemic than the year before. So during the pandemic, it had less gun violence than before. So that was interesting to me. Why would Alaska observe less gun violence? Sure, maybe population dense. Like Alaska, if Alaska is less dense population-wise, so already I'm thinking, okay, there's probably less gun violence because going back to my original rationale for my hypothesis, there's just less people on the streets. So in Alaska, I imagine, because it's less dense, so there's probably like a less opportunities for gun violence to happen. So I would imagine during the lockdown, maybe that's why it decreased. Maybe there's, but that was the case at least for other states. But for Alaska, the lockdown decreased gun violence, or there was a correlation. I guess we can't infer causation here. Perhaps it is, but at a minimum, we can say correlation. Lockdown during a period of the lockdown, we also observed a period of less gun violence, but that's not so for the other states in the States. Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, I wonder if there's like an inflection point of like population density where a lockdown would have contributed more to gun violence, and somewhere below that inflection point, if you're below that inflection point, maybe if Alaska was, then gun violence would have decreased. Who knows? Maybe there's like that critical mass or whatnot. I don't know. I'm now just spewing out different, I don't even know, plausible, but maybe other factors that could have informed why Alaska didn't experience increased gun violence. But nonetheless, okay, so overall around the nation, gun violence has increased. So yes, the media covered this, and there were instances of this. So this aggregate data that we're seeing is like supporting perhaps what was within our subjective instinct, that gun violence has indeed increased. But I was still surprised by this a little bit, probably because I was hanging on to that initial rationale for my hypothesis that if there's just less people on the streets, there's less people to shoot. There's less people to attack. So gun violence would have decreased. So that's what I was thinking. But I mean, maybe some plausible explanations for this are like maybe we're getting angrier, so we're shooting people. It can't be just that we're getting angry, because otherwise we would have seen other crimes increase as well too. Because maybe if we're angrier, then we would commit these other crimes to express our anger. If it was just anger. So I thought maybe it's just not anger, but the fact that we're also angrier, and that gun violence by nature and by definition is like a distant crime. Like you can commit that crime without getting into close contact with someone. It was like if thematically and kind of like definitionally aligned with social distancing. So if we're angrier and we have to social distance, then maybe because it's a distant crime as well too, people are more prone because of those two factors, not individually but jointly, angrier, social being a distant crime. Because of these two factors, that gun violence may have increased. Perhaps, I don't know. But I was still surprised by this a little bit because generally, again, there's less people on the streets, and the gun violence wasn't happening probably, at least based on the media articles I was seeing. It wasn't happening in the house. It wasn't like domestic gun violence. It was gun violence outside. So yeah, so that was and people were during the lockdown. I mean, I guess the lockdown was lifted. When was the lockdown lifted? So this article right now is looking up to March 2021. I wonder if this increase in surge in gun violence was happening like once the lockdown lifted, which was like what, October 20, like late 2020-ish, perhaps. I don't know. But okay, but still a little bit of a surprise to me because generally I would think there'd be less people on the streets, therefore less opportunity for people to be attacked and people to be shot at. Yeah, but takeaway from this article was gun violence did increase nationally. So far, only evidence that violence and crimes have increased during the pandemic. And no evidence really right now so far that violence or crimes have decreased, which was my original hypothesis. So I continued to look, and I stumbled upon this article from NPR.org that was published on July 2020, and this article said something different. This one was supporting my hypothesis that crimes overall have decreased. So here's the line. Baltimore, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, all these major cities, have all witnessed a drop of more than 30% in overall crimes. Violent crimes, however, such as aggravated assaults and robberies, also fell substantially. Oh, okay. So the violent crimes also. So violence is also at least violent crimes have also decreased substantially. So this article supported my hypothesis that crimes and violence have decreased. The article does go on to say that wasn't true of homicides and shootings, though. In some cities, there's a troubling rise compared with last year. And this rise in shootings is consistent with other article that we read from usnews.com that gun violence has increased. So this article didn't just support my hypothesis, but it also supported the statement or the conclusion or the takeaway from usnews.com. So this was one article that supported my hypothesis, and I continue to look for other evidence. I wanted something a little bit more. Yeah, I just wanted to look at more evidence, and I stumbled upon this awesome interactive graph that documented crimes. And this graph looked at total crimes, and you could just filter by violent crimes, like the kind of crime category that what you wanted to look at, and it just was an interactive chart for multiple cities. And in each of these interactive charts, it would track frequency of crimes for the specific crime category that you want to look at for every month and each day of every month. Specifically, it calculated the average of the 7-day moving averages for 2015 to 2020. By averages, like in the number of crime incidents, the average of the crime incidents, 7-day moving averages for 2020 and for 2021. Basically, the moving average part might be complicated. So basically, it was just lines for the frequency of crime incidents throughout the year in examination. So for 2015 to 2020, what generally was like the frequency of crimes, the average of crimes during that pre-pandemic period, what was the frequency of the target crime that you're looking at for 2020 and 2021, 2020, 2021 being the years that span the pandemic period. Basically just looking at granularly, a detailed level, the crime rates in the pandemic period and the crime rate on average in the pre-pandemic period. And they had this interactive chart for like many cities, including, I'm going to click this over here, looking at the chart over Let's see, including, as this chart loads, Atlanta, Austin, Cincinnati, Denver, Fort Worth, Milwaukee, Nashville, Philadelphia, San Francisco, and New York City. If you look at this, if you look at all these charts for many of these cities, and I'm just looking at total crime incidents. Also kudos to University of Pennsylvania, the Quattrone Center from the University of Pennsylvania, for preparing this website. This was awesome, and this helps just give a fuller picture with data, especially in understanding like the frequency and the incident range and crime rates overall. So looking at all these interactive charts for all these different cities, generally you'll see the pandemic period 2020 and 2021, there's been a decrease. It's just like all the lines for 2020 and 2021 generally for all these cities are lower than 2015 to 2020 line for all these cities. Generally, they're mostly lower. There are a few exceptions here and there, but we're working in aggregates right now, in aggregation. So yeah, overall we can say that crime has generally decreased during the pandemic if we look at these interactive charts. Now the question that I also explored was violence. So if we also filter for violence, just looking at violence, let me type that over here. Violence. Why can't I type? Oh, violence. There you go. Okay, let's look at that. Let's add that. So looking at violence, this one was looked relatively the same. So a lot of the lines for 2020 and 2021 seem to be at level-ish, where the 2015-2020 line for crime rates. For Atlanta, Austin was more elevated, slightly elevated. Cincinnati, it seems generally on par. Denver was elevated in the pandemic, but Detroit similar. LA slightly elevated too. Okay, so you know what? Overall, looking at these charts, slightly elevated, but many on par. Like New York City has been less actually. New York City, especially during like when in March, when probably the lockdown, like a very strict lockdown happened from March to June 2020. Definitely crime rates, violent crimes were lower than 2015 to 2020 on average. So that's the case for New York City. Also the case for San Francisco. And the period's long for San Francisco. Generally, most of the year in San Francisco, most of 2020 and 2021, the violent crime rates are lower than the pre-pandemic period from 2015 to 2020. So, you'll see some cities that are less and some big cities that are less, and some cities that have slightly elevated violent crime rates, and then many crime rates that seem to be on par, like Fort Worth seem to be somewhat on par. Detroit somewhat on par as 2015, 2020, the pre-pandemic period too. Baltimore is less actually. So overall, just looking at all these different cities, it seems in aggregate that has remained relatively the same. Violent crimes seem to have remained relatively the same between the pandemic period and the pre-pandemic period. And this is just looking at aggregation of data over time. And that to me was strong evidence and just anecdotal evidence, looking at just one city, just looking at multiple cities over 7 years, right? 2005, all of 2021. Is that 6? 2005, no, 2015. Did I say 2005? No, everything I said, if I said 2005, scrap that. 2015 to 2020. That's the period I was looking at. So 6 years, 6-year time period across multiple, so 27 cities, 27 cities. So that probably just the breadth and the depth of the information here trumped really all the different articles that I read, which were either focused on like one country, countries globally. This is still looking at one country, but looking at like one kind of crime. So at least those articles that looked at just one kind of crime and looking at one city of 7 cities. This breadth and the depth and the length, the time period length that they were observing, to me, this then meant this was probably stronger evidence than the other articles. And because of the strength of this article, then I was able to conclude, my inferences were that indeed crime has decreased. Overall crime has decreased during the pandemic, but violent crimes have remained somewhat relatively similar to pre-pandemic levels. And there's variance there. There will be some cities that have witnessed increased violent crimes during the pandemic, and some cities that have observed less violent crimes, and some cities that have observed about on par with the violent rates that they were experiencing before the pandemic as well. So yeah, that was the evidence I was saying. I encourage you guys to look at the site. It's citycrimestats.com/COVID. And yeah, these interactive charts were pretty robust and great. So we've drawn some of these conclusions, but what are some other inferences that I can draw? And that's where my mind was going. Yeah, and I wanted to understand why this trend was happening. Why have crimes like decreased during the pandemic, but they're increased when it was pre-pandemic? And plus, this was probably a time when the population was still increasing, right? Like the crime rates were decreasing. Actually, yeah, how do you calculate crime rates? Is it per 1,000 people or just... I'm just going to assume this is just by absolute number of crime, like how many crime incidents there were. I think that's probably what it was too. And assuming that, and if population is increasing, then like per 1,000 people, like per capita, crime is decreasing. So that's interesting as well too. We have more people and more opportunities for crime to be committed against others, but yet crime was decreasing. So that might be just a grisly picture of human nature. Maybe we're just more prone, inclined to commit crimes when we're interacting with others. But I also thought maybe it's not human nature. Maybe it's also just the very definition of a crime, something just technical. It's not our human nature. Like, for example, you need more than one person in order to have a scenario where a crime is committed. So, like, generally, you can't commit a crime against yourself. Yes, there's maybe perhaps if we really stretch the definition or really explore other, there might be time for it. Like that might be a better topic for another podcast. But generally, crimes, you have to have at least two people for a crime to be committed and to occur. So if we don't have as many scenarios where there are two or more people or there are a lot of people, then by definition, crimes are going to decrease. So a circumstance that enables crimes to occur during the pandemic, that circumstances was less. So therefore, crimes were less. So it's not maybe just human nature, really, like human nature because we're interacting more and we're just more prone to commit crimes. Maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just that circumstances, technical circumstance for crimes to occur were just not as frequent because we were in lockdown, we were in the pandemic. And then that by itself might have contributed to crimes decreasing. Yeah. So yeah, those are some of the inferences that can be drawn. Maybe both were contributory. Maybe one was really the contributory one, human nature, or just just the technical definition of what constitutes a crime and the condition for that definition to be upheld, just probably being less and fewer in frequency and in frequency really during the pandemic and the lockdown. So yeah, those are some thoughts that I had. These are potential inferences I could have drawn, but I don't have evidence pointing one way or the other. This was just me just trying to analyze intuitively and just with my critical thinking. So yeah, I leave those just as thoughts. I do want to mention that one caveat I think during discussing all this is that here when we're talking about all these numbers and reporting 30% or 39,000 to 51,000, all these numbers, we're assuming that the number of reports actually equals the number of crimes that were committed and that were cited in these articles and these charts. So that's not always the case. Like just because there could be underreporting of crimes. Many people could not have reported a crime. So actually the number of crimes that actually happened might have been much higher, could have been much higher. And that is very well much of a possibility maybe if domestic violence is increasing, you're spending more time at home, I don't know, maybe you're less prone to make calls and make reports. And this may have been a time also with the George Floyd, um, with the George Floyd incident, that people were just less trusting of the police too. So maybe they're less prone to call the police. I don't know. So whatever it may be, it's possible that there could have been some underreporting of crimes, and maybe actual number of crimes was actually higher than reported, and potentially because of this underreporting, maybe we are just not seeing the phenomenon or the reality that crimes have actually increased during the pandemic. It is possible. So for my conclusions to hold that crimes have decreased during the pandemic, we have to assume that the number of reports roughly equals the number of crimes that were actually committed. But if this caveat is present in both pre-pandemic and pandemic, if they're underreporting, like the same percentage of underreporting in both pre-pandemic period and pandemic period, then this caveat is kind of nullified, because the decrease and or the underreporting is present in both. So I don't know, it's like simple arithmetic, kind of like they would balance each other out. Like one error, the same error would have been present in the same magnitude of the error would have been present in like the pandemic period data and the pre-pandemic data, and therefore you can still make a comparative analysis and that would still be valid. All right, so that's a caveat, but that caveat's also kind of nullified if it's present in both sets of data, pre-pandemic and pandemic. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Overall conclusion, if caveats hold, crimes have decreased during the pandemic, and violent crimes have remained relatively the same, with some variance across cities. All right, hope you guys found that useful. This was an interesting exercise for me, and this was really also just started with a Google search result too. So there you have it. Thanks guys for listening. If you enjoyed, please don't hesitate to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.